You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
Satan is testing as to, well, if we do this, will we mislead the church? If we do this, will we mislead the church? If we do this, they're actually doing all of it. He is. Persecution, you name it. But he's working through potential battle plans to see what will work to thwart the plans of God and prevent Jesus from returning. That's what he wants to prevent. He wants to prevent Jesus from returning. Not going to work, but that's what he's trying to do. Each church reflects how the work is going on both sides of the equation.
As Christians, we know who Satan is, but do we fully understand why he does what he does? Today, Pastor Ken reminds us that as Christians, we can't forget Satan's number one goal, to dismantle the church. Instead of only focusing on your own sin and how Satan tempts you, look at it from a larger perspective as how he's slowly chipping away at God's church. He wants you to be blinded by your own mistakes so that you can't see the bigger picture. Don't forget about the church at large and bring people to him. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Revelation chapter 2 with today's edition of The Unsafe Bible.
We're still talking about all the different churches, and we're coming to the third church. It's Pergamum, okay? Or Pergamus, depending upon how you translate it. And it's Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. So, of the 7 cities that Jesus has had John write to so far, we've covered Ephesus, which is an example of the apostolic or new church, which is doctrinally challenged, but retains doctrinal purity at the expense of loving anybody, including the Lord. But they do have their doctrine correct. And unfortunately, we know churches like that exist today. Smyrna is the second church. That's an example of the church under persecution, and that exists today, as we found out. That exists all over the place today. So now we come to the church at Pergamum. And this is an example of the church that came into existence as a result of the Edict of Toleration signed by Constantine. It's the church of compromise. Now, Pergamum is inland. It's not on the coast. So this is the first city we're going to look at that is actually inland in Asia Minor. It's about 25 miles or so from the Aegean Sea. But something we need to remember as we look at this next city in line is what Jesus is actually doing by talking to each of these churches and verifying the fact that he knows them and he knows what they're doing, is he's verifying combat actions and operations that he specified earlier in the New Testament. He had original instructions that he provided prior to his death, burial, and resurrection, and then just after that, where he gave the church some instructions as to what they should be doing. And now he's checking in to see how's that working? How's that going? The book of Revelation provides us a blow-by-blow plan and description as to how Yahweh will overturn the rebels of Genesis 3, 6, and 11. Because by the time we get to the end of Revelation, Eden's on earth, which is the way God wanted it to begin with. And the rebels are gone. Jesus has been and currently is the commander of the Lord's hosts. He's the one that met Joshua as Joshua was walking around the outskirts of Jericho. Jesus was the commander of the Lord's host. He's involved and has been involved in combat operations all throughout the scriptures, where it says one evening the angel of the Lord came and visited the Assyrian army, which was parked just outside the gates of Jerusalem, and killed over 100,000 troops. That was another appearance of Jesus Christ. He is the one that did that. Recall the instructions he gave at Caesarea Philippi. Now we read that in Matthew, and we just kind of go over it, and we don't think much about it, but it does play into this. Jesus laid out instructions in detail in Matthew 16, showing where the assault against the enemy, the unseen realm, the fallen divine being, Satan and his henchmen, whatever you want to call them, where it's going to take place, and where he expects us to be finding new followers of Jesus Christ. Again, remember, there's a real war going on in the unseen realm. He took his disciples straight to Caesarea Philippi, which is just down the hill from Mount Hermon, which is where the Watchers supposedly descended in Genesis chapter 6 and began all of that foolishness and rebellion. Caesarea Philippi was considered the gates of hell by the Jews and by Gentiles at the same time. And in Matthew 16, verses 13 to 23, Jesus said, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said this, he's standing right in front of the cave there. And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter replied, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And I tell you, you're Peter. And on this rock I will build my church." He's not pointing to Peter, okay? He's pointing to the rock inside the grotto, because there's a rock in there, which was considered the gates of hell, because his next comment is, "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So what he's saying is we're going to be on an offensive operation. We're going to be going against the gates of hell, and we're going to be taking people out of that destination. We're going to be removing them from a guaranteed trip to someplace they don't want to go and changing their eternal destination. He says, "I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. And from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day and be raised. And Peter took him aside to rebuke him and said, "Far be it from you, Lord, this will never happen." And he turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." That site that they were at is world famous in the ancient world as the center of the worship of Pan, and there was also a temple there to Zeus. If you follow the breadcrumbs, historically, Zeus is another name for a guy named Satan, but he's gone by a lot of different names. At this time, he was also considered to be the incarnate Augustus Caesar, and you name it. It was goofy. But what Jesus is doing is he's standing right at the place known as the gates of hell. He's saying to the enemy on their turf, right in front of the mountain that they thought they owned, that the church, we as his church, will be taking folks who are literally on their way to hell and turn them into believers. So he's giving an upfront view to the enemy as to here's how the combat operations are going to go. We're going to be taking people that you think are on your side, they're going to be on our side by the time we're done. We're going to take them directly from you. He wanted to make it clear to the enemy that war was about to be expanded, but they didn't quite get that because they thought they would kill him and be done with him. That was a big mistake for them because he rose from the dead and kind of changed everything. But fast forward a few weeks, and Jesus, after being resurrected, gives additional marching orders to his followers, okay? So he said, we're going to be reaching out and grabbing people who are on their way to hell. And now he gives additional operations orders as to how the battle is going to go down. And he does that in Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20, where he says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, or basically better said, as you are going, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Okay, so those are the instructions he gave to the church. He gave actually to his disciples who should be communicating it to the church. So now it's 90 AD, 93 AD, somewhere in there, and it's report card time. How are they all doing? We've seen the first two report cards. Not that bad, okay? Jesus is checking in with his followers. The church, have they been doing what he wants them to do? He's been watching, and he's deeply involved. We talked about that. Oh, one more thing to consider as we look at each church. Each church is not only an existing church in Asia Minor, they're also pictures of church history. We talked about that. But they're also a reflection how the battle is going, not just for them, but for the church in time. The churches all have a level of persecution that's always going on at some point, but there are other things that take place too. And what you're seeing is examples that Satan is testing as to, well, if we do this, will we mislead the church? If we do this, will we mislead the church? If we do this, they're actually doing all of it, he is. persecution, you name it. But he's working through potential battle plans to see what will work to thwart the plans of God and prevent Jesus from returning. That's what he wants to prevent. He wants to prevent Jesus from returning. Not going to work, but that's what he's trying to do. Each church reflects how the work is going on both sides of the equation. How the church is doing with the battle as well as how the enemy is doing. And they also reflect church history, the overall effectiveness of the enemy at times, but also they reflect the power that Jesus provides his followers as we reflect the simple fact that in him we're overcomers and nothing can stand against us as long as we rely on him. So now we come to Pergamum. The word Pergamum is actually coming from two root words. And the first word means high, and the second one means marriage. This word in the Greek is actually translated and used in the English for a couple other words. Polygamy comes from it, and so does bigamy. Does that tell you that there's a problem with this word? Pergamum means high marriage or marriage that shouldn't be taking place at one level or another. And that's a problem. So as we're traveling north from Smyrna, which is where we've been, we were on the coast, we follow the coastline for 40 miles, and then we get to the Caicus River Valley, and then we turn right, and now we're going to travel about another 20, it said 10 miles here, but it's actually more like 20 miles, inland from the Aegean Sea, and you come to Pergamum. Pliny the Elder actually noted where it was and all the different towns around it. I'm not going to go through it. There it is if you want to read it. And he said all kinds of things. By the way, the town today is called Pergamo. It was during Pliny's time as well. But the city was an early seat of Christianity, one of the 7 churches in the apostolic epistles. And he says its ruins are still to be seen. So where is Pergamus? When you approach it, the first thing you see is this 1,000-foot tall mountain off in the distance. That used to be where Pergamum, or Pergamus, was located. That's the Acropolis. But this town, this whole area, was part of an empire, and it was actually willed by Attalus III to Rome in 133 BC. And again, when Julius Caesar was in power, upon his death, the city was given to Mark Antony, and he gave all 200,000 books from the library to Cleopatra. And she took all the books and moved them to Alexandria. So much for the battle about parchment and papyrus that all wound up in Egypt anyhow. Now, Jews often identified the pagan gods with demons. We know that they were associated with fallen divine beings. We know that. But they identified the Greeks' chief god Zeus with Satan. And they just would naturally extend to that. So when compared to the other gods worshipped in Pergamum, and there are a lot of them, okay? We've already seen Athena, Asclepius, Dionysus. We're going to find there's like 6, 7 major gods that they worship there. Zeus is number one, in my mind, as the candidate for Satan's throne. Now, there are some who say it's Athena. There are some who say, no, it's Asclepius since it's a snake. There are some who say, oh, no, it's the temple to the Caesars, or you could say it's all of them combined. But I tend to think it's Zeus and his throne, and a lot of it is because of the way it's been treated historically from that time period as well as since it's been moved to Berlin. Consider this. The museum was not completed and opened until 1930. One of the first visitors was a gentleman by the name of Albert Speer. Albert Speer was the architect for Nazi Germany. Okay? And he built an auditorium for all of the different things that they were doing at the Zeppelin field in Nuremberg. Okay? And that was where they had their Nazi rallies. When we look at this, you'll suddenly realize that Greek mythology is not mythological, that there really is a power behind this, and this power is okay with going with whoever is going to try and achieve what that power wants to have achieved. Now remember, Nazi Germany, altar to Zeus, rebuilt, and it was copied by Albert Speer, but on a larger scale. There it is. This is the area in Nuremberg where all the Nazi rallies took place. It still stands today. It just doesn't have the swastikas on it. Now think again, altar of Zeus, altar of Satan, or throne of Satan is what it says here in the scriptures. And who was behind this, and what did that individual try to do? Tried to kill every Jew on the face of the planet. Okay? Now all of a sudden it starts to come together. This is not mythology. This is very, very real. These are the fallen ones impersonating as these different gods. And they're okay with you thinking that they're harmless. They aren't. In 168 BC, the temple was desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes when he went in and offered an offering in the Holy of Holies to who? Zeus. He offered a pig. In fact, he actually also called himself Zeus Epiphanius, or the manifestation of Zeus. And he demanded himself be worshipped in the place of God. So we see him saying he's Zeus, and he wants Zeus worshipped in the Holy of Holies. If you recall what it says in the book of Ezekiel, there's a guy by the name of Satan. Ezekiel's actually talking to somebody who's the king of Tyre, but he talks about the fact that he wants Zion. He wants to rule on Zion. That's what this is all about. Jesus points to this in Matthew 24 and says, in the tribulation time period, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand those who in Judea must flee to the mountains. Antiochus Epiphanes said, I'm Zeus, worship Zeus here on this mountain. Adolf Hitler tried to kill all the Jews. He did the same thing. The Antichrist is going to do that in the temple in Jerusalem after he is possessed by Satan. Do we now know who Zeus is? I think it becomes obvious. That's why I'm saying the temple to Zeus is Satan's throne. That's why I say that. If you follow the breadcrumbs, starting in Genesis 3, and you start looking at the different gods that show up in the scriptures, you have Marduk. Well, he's the king of the gods under Babylon. But as you start tracking it, they track him back to Eden. Then there's Baal. He changed his name. Now he's called Baal. That just means Lord. But he's the Canaanite king of the gods. He lived on Mount Zaphon, which we today call Jebel al-Akra. It's a mountain in South Turkey, near the Mediterranean, right around the Turkish-Syrian border. Then once the Greeks became having a culture, then he became known as Zeus, king of the gods for the Greeks. You can go through thousands of pages of documentation to get to this, but that's kind of what I've concluded looking at all of it. So the final abomination of desolation by the Antichrist, who will demand worship by the entire world, with death being the cost of refusal, there will be Jews who will be unwilling to worship the beast and his images, just like Jews were during the time of the Maccabees in the day of Antiochus. It's all happening all over again. That's why Jesus pointed to it. And I really think that when John, writing for Jesus, talks about the throne of Satan, he's talking about that temple that's sitting underneath the trees there on top of the mountain. Revelation 13:2, and the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon, that's another name for Satan, gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So you start putting the pieces together. The throne of Satan, in my mind, is the altar of Zeus. It's the same thing. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to eliminate Judaism, thinking he was a manifestation of Zeus, Satan. The Antichrist, when revealed and demanding worship, will be empowered by Satan, Zeus. All of a sudden, mythology becomes a lot more interesting to read. There are other candidates in Pergamum for this, by the way, but I believe it's the altar to Zeus, okay? Now, further up the hill, you have the altar to Athena. There's temples everywhere in this town, and I'm only at the first level of the Acropolis. There's 3 levels. This was a big town. They had a couple 100,000 people when it was fully moving. It was the seat of the Roman Empire in that area. It was the capital city for Asia. It was not a free city. They had a proconsul there who had the authority for death. The economy and the culture of the city was all based on pagan cults that were in the city, all of them. That's what the culture was all about. Remember, we talked about that with Ephesus and the problem that Paul had when he was preaching the gospel, and he was upsetting the economic well-being of the town. Now all of a sudden it makes sense what Jesus did when he went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee to cut 2,000 demons loose from one guy, and they all went into pigs. The moment they went into pigs and the pigs went into the water, he killed the economy of all the idol worshipers on that side of the lake. That was an intentional act. So we have Zeus, Athena, Demeter, Dionysius, emperor worship. We also have an Egyptian god by the name of Serapis who's going to show up. We have Asclepius. In the middle Acropolis layer, this is the middle layer, you have a gymnasium. Demeter is the god of athletes. So you have that and an odium. So you can read some poetry if you want to after you're done working out, which is what they did. And at the lower level is where you find the stadium where they actually killed Christians, aqueducts, and then there's the temple to Serapis as well as the Asclepium. The 2nd century Serapion was converted to a church later in the 5th century. But in the architecture of this building, they found a thing involving ventriloquism. One of the job requirements they've determined from this that priests would have to have is they all had to be ventriloquists. If they weren't ventriloquists, then they couldn't be hired to make the idol speak. Okay? They used ventriloquism to make the idols speak. They actually found devices inside this building to do that. That's the building they found them in. So they practiced cultic ventriloquism to make people think that the idol was really speaking. It wasn't. It was the guy behind the curtain who was speaking. But that just, again, shows you how Satan lies. He just does. And in the lower city, you could travel via Sacred Road to the Asclepion. It was, again, a resort. It was a resort. You take the road down, and you could go see Asclepius and sleep with the snakes. For those involved with the Asclepius cult, you would be isolated for 3 days. You'd be purified through baths and abstinence, and you would sacrifice a piglet to Asclepius. So you'd get bacon at the end of the day. And then another central component was the hope that the god would visit the petitioner in a dream and offer instructions for healing. They have found all kinds of things. In fact, similes and copies of the different body parts that they wanted healed in this place. All these different altars, all these different things that are there in Pergamum, I fall into the camp that the throne of Satan, which we're going to see in this section of Scripture, is the altar of Zeus. But with all the altars and gods that were worshipped there, pick one or all. Because you pick one. Some commentators pick all, saying there's an overwhelming burden of them being there that makes this Satan's base of operations. All I see is there are a lot of alternative distractions to anybody who lives here, okay? Each temple has its own market connected to the sacrifices in it. So you have the market for Zeus, the market for Athena, the market for Demeter. They all have their own markets. And some have better produce and better meat than the others. They have festivals taking place all year long. Athletics were huge, so Demeter would have a huge presence there too. And, of course, they were the first city to worship the Caesars. They understood that Domitian was not worthwhile. They did Trajan instead. But stop and think. For a patriotic citizen to live we talked about this with Smyrna, now you're living in Pergamum, to be a patriotic citizen, you have to go to the altar of the Caesar at least once a year with a pinch of incense and say, Caesar is Lord. Christians wouldn't do that.
You've been listening to a message from Revelation on the Unsafe Bible. Pastor Ken has been diving deep into this final book of the Bible. If you're into fantasy or sci-fi, you might be naturally drawn toward Revelation. There's all kinds of imagery and strange creatures that are described. But more than any of this, you're reminded of the preeminence of God and that He rules over everything. He rules over all people, nations, and He has more power than the evil that can try to take over the world. What a relief that you can know and trust in this God. Are you confused about anything you heard today? Don't hesitate to contact us. You can get in touch with us by going to theunsafebible.com. Once there, Go to the Connect tab and click on Connect Card. Then you can fill out a form for us to get in touch with you. To listen to this message or any others from this series in Revelation, just look under the Media tab at theunsafebible.com. You'll also find additional teachings in other books of the Bible. If you found this ministry to be a blessing to you as you've been listening, you have the opportunity to help support the Unsafe Bible ministry by checking out the Give tab. We're grateful for any donation given to help further the message of the gospel. Any other questions? Feel free to explore the unsafebible.com. For more information about when and where we meet, we're based out of Jupiter, Florida, and would be happy to meet you. Join us again here for another message from the book of Revelation on the Unsafe Bible.